today was day 3 of the impeachment. The Democrats presented their case in chief, and they're done. So the way that the rules were set up for this entire trial was the Democrats were going to have about 16 hours to present their case. The Republicans, or not the Republicans, but really Trump, has 16 hours to present his case. And so yesterday we had a lot of testimony from a number of different House impeachment managers in the Senate. These were House representatives. And today they sort of wrapped up early and they were done. They fleshed out their entire case. They talked about a lot of different things. We didn't hear anything from Trump or his team. So today is really just kind of a critique or compliments for what the Democrats did in the quote trial, in the quote court today. So I want to go through some of the good, some of the bad. Then we'll take a look at some of the specific language and some of the testimony that was given by these House managers. And then you can see whether or not they match up with sort of my conclusion. So let's start with some of the good stuff. Like we talked about yesterday, the Democrats have been doing a good job on this, in my opinion, just because of their persuasion techniques. Now, a lot of these persuasion techniques, I think, are somewhat obvious, but they're using them effectively. And you're going to see today there was a lot of this called thinking past the sale. And so, this is a concept that we'll talk a lot about. I think I even have a slide here where I'll explain what that was. But the Democrats were just sort of talking like Trump has already been convicted. They're saying, we have to do this, or, this is going to be done so this does not happen again. And you're saying, well, what do you mean again? Have you proved that it happened the first time? Or are you just talking about preventing this from happening again and Donald Trump being responsible for it? So they're sort of talking like it's already been determined that Donald Trump was responsible for inciting the quote insurrection. So a lot of good technique there, stuff that I don't think necessarily would fly in court, in a real court, but it was a good technique. And as I'm going through this, keep this in mind. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I'm used to practicing in a real court with real rules of evidence and real rules of procedure. And there really wasn't much of that in this proceeding. And so when I'm I'm holding a lot of the Democrats to those standards because I think those standards are important. Due process, confrontation clause, the ability to present evidence, the ability to limit the scope of the evidence to only stuff that is relevant and pertinent to the final issue. And so those are the things that I think are important for a legitimate trial, for a legitimate procedure. And those aren't really the same rules that take place in the Senate. And the way that they were presenting their case was in conformity with their rules, not with the standard traditional rules that you would see in an ordinary court of law. It was sort of a political set of rules that they had an agreement with the Republicans before the trial started. And so they were adhering to their rules. And I'm a big fan of people playing to the rules, right? If they set the rules, they know what they are, they should use them to their maximum advantage. And they did that. Now, those rules, in my opinion, were not necessarily in conformity with what you would expect from a legitimate trial, but that's okay, because it's their rules and they're playing to those rules. So, when you hear those types of critiques, just keep that in mind. They were adhering to the rules very, very nicely, and they were exploiting them for maximum advantage, which is a good thing if you want to win a case. They were also doing a lot of this emotional appeal stuff. We had this from yesterday, a lot of emotional appeals. They sort of shifted the narrative from this was really bad to this is still bad. This is an ongoing threat. This is something we're going to see more and more of. They were referencing some Capitol Hill reports from other law enforcement agencies that came out, I think, on the 13th of January, about a week after the January 6th riots. And they were using this report to say, this is still ongoing. We still have this continuing threat that we have to address. And the only way we can do that is by convicting Donald Trump. So even though, that's sort of outside the scope of why they're there, they're trying to determine, in my opinion, whether or not Donald Trump was actually responsible for the original incitement. Now they're sort of saying, well, we have to punish him so that this does not happen again, which is effective, right? I think it's totally outside the scope, but it's effective, and they did a lot of that today. They also use what I call the high ground maneuver. Actually, I didn't invent that. This is something that a lot of people call the high ground maneuver, where they talked a lot about the world stage. So they were sort of taking this out of the weeds a little bit. Traditionally, of course, in politics, especially in America, it's the Republicans are bad, the Democrats are bad, the Republicans are good, the Democrats are good, and they're both sort of at each other's throats. And poor libertarians, nobody cares about them. But, the point is, it's just very localized, and they're very aggressive and sort of in the weeds. You said this, no, you said that. And it's sort of stuff that a lot of people just consider to be political bickering or a lot of political noise. The country has a lot of problems. People are expecting our politicians to be focused on some of the real issues, but of course they're not. They're focused on the bickering, minutia that a lot of us sort of, want to claw our earballs off, eyeballs out and ears off because of just how monotonous it can be. So the Democrats today sort of pulled it out of those weeds a little bit. They said, listen, our foreign enemies are going to be looking at how we're governing ourselves here, and they're going to sort of see this as an opening, an opportunity to come in and cause some other malfeasance in our country. But also think about our allies. The people around the world look to us with reverence as Americans, and they think that the United States has due process and civility, and we're leaders of the world. And so if we don't impugn Donald Trump, if we don't hold him accountable, then that means that we're failing the world, right? And that's a big ask. So you're taking the high ground on this while everybody else is bickering about due process and cross-examinations and those types of things. They're saying we're leaders on a world stage. And so it's persuasive. It's stuff that I think a lot of people will resonate with. In terms of the public, senators, it's a foregone conclusion. I don't think that they're going to vote to convict Trump no matter what. But this isn't really for that purpose. It's kind of a public spectacle. They're trying to get a lot of mileage out of the January 6th riots, and this is a good and effective way to do that. They also touched on, I'm going to give them some credit for this, they actually did touch on some due process arguments and some First Amendment arguments. So you're going to see there was a rebuttal from Ted Lieu and Joe Nagusi, who were sort of doing a pre-buttal for Donald Trump. So they know that his defense lawyers will be out tomorrow, and they were already rebutting some of their claims that they're expected to make. So I think that's a good technique. And then yesterday, or same issue as yesterday, very good pacing and good energy like yesterday. A lot of the speakers were, time was kept, was appropriate. They didn't ramble on for too long. Good pace, changed them up pretty quickly. And it was just sort of it's a lot of the same faces that we saw yesterday, but sort of a good rotation, and it kept people's attention, and it was a lot of information. So if you were interested in it and this was sort of your side, you probably enjoyed it. Now, some of the bad stuff. Okay, now this is some of the same things that we talked about yesterday. There were a lot of personal stories here, a lot. And I thought that they were very overly duplicative. We've already heard about this. They spent basically all day yesterday talking about how horrendous this whole situation was. And we got that point. Like, that point has been beaten into the ground. It's been beaten to death. They've showed videos and images and news article after news article and online post. We get it, right? We get it. And in my mind, this is missing the mark pretty dramatically. And I'll show you that based on the flow chart that we were discussing yesterday and the day prior to that. But basically, in my opinion, the crux of their case should have been more about causation. Donald Trump said something, and that was directly responsible for the Capitol Hill riots. And a lot of that, in my take on this, it just wasn't there. They were sort of doing an end run around a lot of the issues that I think are legally important, and they were going from Donald Trump said a bad thing to this bad thing happened, and that's kind of it. And so they're subverting a lot of the process and procedure that you would see in a traditional legal proceeding. They also really expanded the scope today. So sort of this is converse to what we were talking about the world stage, right? And calling this an ongoing threat. Those are really outside the scope of what we were supposed to be doing here if we're trying to dial in and get down to whether or not Donald Trump was responsible for this stuff. So I said the scope expanded to include the entire world. Now we're thinking about the whole world now. We're thinking about continuing threats. We're talking about post-incitement. So they spent some time today talking about what Donald Trump was doing after the Capitol Hill riot took place. And then they also were talking about penalties. Okay, so a lot of penalties. And that's just, that's kind of a whole separate phase in a case, in a criminal case, in a criminal court of law. When you have a trial, you're talking about whether or not a person was guilty of committing that crime. You don't talk about the sentencing. The sentencing is a different part of the case. So let's say, okay, you go on a trial, somebody gets, found guilty, let's say for murder. You don't talk about what the penalty is, whether it's 25 to life or the death penalty or 10 years or 15 years for a manslaughter, whatever that looks like. You don't talk about that. That's for a whole different proceeding. That's for sentencing. You just talk about the facts of the case. Did that person murder that other person? And anything that's beyond that question is outside the scope. And so, you would never in a criminal trial talk about, essentially what what a neighboring state would do if your client is found innocent, right? If we find this person not guilty of murder, well, then people in New Mexico are just going to start murdering people. They're going to feel the consequences of this outcome here today, right? The judge would be like, what the hell are you talking about? That's totally irrelevant. All right. The question here is, on this date, location, time, in this facility, did this happen? And anything else is sort of extraneous. It's not part of the underlying issue. And so the scope in this proceeding was just massively blown out of proportion, which was expected, right? There's nobody in there objecting, saying, well, that's not relevant. That's outside the scope. That's beyond the issue. They're just saying, okay, well, they get 16 hours. They can go in there and talk about whatever the hell they want. And they were using that to full effect, which is why I gave them points for thinking past the sale and trying to effectuate the high ground maneuver by lifting up the debate onto the world stage. They also, in my opinion, if you've been on this channel for some period of time, you've heard me be very, I would say, in favor of strong First Amendment protections. And when they were doing their pre-buttal, even though they mentioned the First Amendment, they sort of did it in a way saying, well, it's not that important. So I considered that to be a watering down of the First Amendment. I do not like the fact that that is precedent now. I don't like the fact that the House representatives in an official proceeding on the floor of the Senate were talking about how the First Amendment is kind of not really applicable here. I thought that was kind of dangerous precedent. I don't even like the idea that argument is being made, but it's being made. And so I gave them a bad on that. Same type of thing with the due process stuff. So you're going to hear, I'm already seeing this stuff around Twitter, little understanding of due process. Okay, so they're talking a lot about, well, this was, Trump had all the due process that he's entitled to. He had this thing and we voted on it while he was still here and he had a chance to participate in his defense and all this stuff. And you're thinking, wait a minute, come on. Like, we all know that is total BS, right? If you have a judge who's also a Democrat, who's a witness, and is somebody who's going to be voting as a juror, that's not even close to due process, right? That's not even resembling it. But they are, because it's a biased judge. It's completely biased, right? It'd be like us taking a case into court and the police officer who cited our client is also going to be the judge and was a witness to the arrest and then is going to vote as to whether or not our client is guilty. You're going, what? That's... Due process is supposed to create some protections for the defendant who's going through the mechanisms of the justice system. And here, the whole thing was just kind of a joke. So they touched on due process a little bit, sort of in passing, just to pre-butt Donald Trump's argument. But I mean, if you just look at it objectively, a lot of the same elements that you would find in a regular criminal trial that would protect due process just were not prevalent here. And I understand what they were doing. They have to address it because Trump's team is going to bring it up tomorrow, but it's a little bit of a stretch. I would say it's a big bit of a stretch. And then lastly, I already sort of touched on this, but they were focused on the consequences and not on the criminality. So again, the effects. They were focused on the effects of the Capitol Hill riots without ever really getting to the answer or making, in my opinion, what would be a very solid case that would justify talking about the effects, because they didn't connect the dots. They didn't connect that Donald Trump was ultimately responsible for the incitement and the damage. They just sort of talked about the damage and the consequences and just said, well, Donald Trump was there, so he's responsible for it, without making that causal connection. Now, I did spend some time watching it today, in and out of it, but apparently a lot of senators were not doing that. So I wanted to just call this to your attention. The Wall Street Journal, the senators show signs of fading as the impeachment trial continues. So as the third day of the impeachment trial continued, some senators appear to be run down by the long days. Many were hunched over their desks, leaning back. At one point, Bernie Sanders hung his head and appeared to be resting. John Thune, a Republican, switched between taking notes, playing with his pen, and picking his fingernails. We got Rick Scott writing on a blank map of Asia. He had studied what appeared to be a map of Southeast Asia during yesterday's proceedings as well. So maybe he's taking a trip over there. Handful of Republican senators chatted during the presentations. During video of the Michigan protest, Ben Sass of Nebraska, Tim Scott of South Carolina, they chatted briefly. We got Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Kevin Kramer of North Dakota. They also were talking. As impeachment manager, Jamie Raskin was speaking. So basically the point of this article is saying that they weren't paying attention, right? Senator Kramer Senator Toomey exchanged a few words and appeared to laugh. Many senators on both sides took notes much of the time. We got Bill Cassidy, one senator who changed his vote Monday night, sided with all the Democrats and 5 Republicans in saying the trial was constitutional, wrote furiously on a notepad. So Mr. Cassidy has said his mind is not yet made up on the final vote. By about 2 p.m., there were 15 Republicans missing from the chamber. And I'm already seeing on Twitter, people are just outraged about this. Well, if they weren't there, if you're a juror in a criminal trial, you can't get up and leave the jury box and you can't do all this stuff. Therefore, they should not count. We should just take those 15 Republicans, throw them out of the final vote, and just have a vote with the actual quorum, which the people who were there and observed the whole thing. And I just think it's hysterical now that a lot of the political commentators are now sort of invoking some of the same criminal procedures that you would expect in a criminal case. Well, if you're in a criminal case, you can't leave. You can't the jury can't leave. And you say, well, I know, but in a criminal case, you wouldn't have a police officer as the judge and the juror also, right? So let's just take it easy on this stuff, okay? The whole thing is not following traditional procedures that you would find in any other real court of law in this country that I've ever been to, okay? Maybe that's not true. There's one up here in I'm not going to call the name of it, but it's very, very far out on the outskirts where it's kind of a wacko land out there. So we'll just leave that be, but it's not the right way to run things. And so to see a lot of these, armchair lawyers now coming out and saying, this is just egregious, they should be thrown out of the proceedings. I'm going, do you really think that the rest of this was by the book? Do you really think that this was a brilliant presentation that is in comportment with the rest of what we think is valuable in a lawful due process heavy criminal proceeding? It's not even close to that. We have articles from CNN that are being introduced as evidence. We've got tweets, we've got posts from the Donald.win that are being introduced. I mean, the whole thing is just like laughable. But now they want to go back to the rules. So we're going to see a lot of that. You're going to see both sides making up a bunch of stuff about the final outcome. They're just, they're doing what they can to win it in the face of knowing that the Republicans are just not going to convict him basically no matter what. So, all right. So once again, this is the flow chart that we've been working through. Jurisdiction, we talked about that. I think that was on Tuesday. Then, in my opinion, if I were prosecuting this case, I would want to, first and foremost, make sure that we have incitement buttoned down, that Donald Trump did something that overcomes the Brandenburg test that led to the insurrection, and that insurrection could not be defended by political speech. The reds are the defense sort of stop signs. Then we have formal causation. Donald Trump would not be able to work his way out of causation because as a prosecutor, you would be able to show that he was the direct cause. There was no intervening cause. There was no superseding cause. And that cause, so basically his words from the incitement that led to the insurrection that caused the interference with the government could not be attributed to negligence on behalf of the government. And then that would lead to a final verdict. So we've talked about that a few times. Now today, we sort of skipped over almost all of this. Today was a lot about sort of jumping from, as I mentioned, the riot attack, so the harm, or the look at that, that's just brutal right there. So the harm, the Capitol Hill riots, we sort of bypassed a lot of this stuff today. We touched a little bit on free speech here. We talked a little bit about political speech, but most of this was sort of just going around. We weren't even really focused on the verdict. We were kind of focused on everything that happens after the verdict, right? So we talked a lot about what the world thought and our allies and everybody else, and just how damaging this is going to be to America on a world stage. And we kind of glossed over a lot of this other stuff today. Now, some of it we did cover yesterday. We kind of ran through it, but it was sort of an end run around what I would consider to be a formal due process-ish proceeding, but those are the rules. So they're allowed to do that. As I mentioned, there's nobody there to hold them accountable to that. They just say, okay, just do whatever you want. You got 8 hours. That's why the Republicans were just sort of, okay, we've had enough. We've seen enough of this stuff. So that was what the process looked like to me. As I mentioned, the scope here was also massively expanded. This was the original scope that we saw in the article of impeachment. The only thing that we saw in those 5 pages of documents were false statements. We won by a landslide was the statement that Donald Trump made that they weren't happy with. If you don't have a country, you're not going to be able to, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And then we had the Raffensperger phone call. And previously, there were a lot of other issues that were outside of the scope that they did not bring in. Things like anything Donald Trump Jr. said, things Rudy Giuliani said, things Cindy Powell said. We talked about this yesterday. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But then when we saw the Democrats' memorandum come out, all of these external issues were now lumped into the same issue. So they went inside the blue circle, and they were talking about it. They talked about a lot of these things. We saw this sort of on parade yesterday. Now, today, more issues came up. We talked about Russia, China, Iran, this concept here that Trump will do it again, and that our allies care, and what the world thinks is important, and all of those other things. And so even the scope that was yesterday, these are new issues that were outside of the memorandum, and today, those were all inside. So they brought the Russia, China, Iran stuff in, the Trump will do it again stuff, the dangerous MAGA people. We have our allies care, and we've got what the world thinks. So the scope just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's good moving. It's nice work, Democrats. Well done, right? I mean, they can just continue to do that. All of those external issues would have been laughed out of court in a regular court proceeding unless they were particularly relevant to the issue at hand, but most of them are not. Okay, what China, Russia, and Iran think about the Capitol Hill riots is irrelevant, in my opinion, to what actually happened and whether or not Donald Trump was responsible for it. So let's get into the actual proceeding. Spent a lot of time on that, but it says here at 11:18 a.m. today, Rep. Raskin said, "We'll have no one to blame but ourselves if Trump is reelected and incites further violence." So this is good, right? This is thinking past the sale. He's saying, this is going to happen again. He already incited one set of violence, and so if we don't act now, he's going to incite further violence. Okay, it hasn't been proven yet because he has not been convicted that he actually incited the first incident, but he's already talking about preventing the next one. It's called thinking past the sale. The analogy that I've heard used a few times is when you go and you buy a car at a car dealership, and the car dealer says, "You're going to love taking your kids to soccer practice in this thing." And you go, "Yeah, I would love that," right? He's already presuming that you are going to buy the car. He's not trying to sell you the car. He's already considered that you've bought it and you're going to love it when you take your kids to soccer practice. So same type of thing here, right? We have to act to prevent further incitement. That's presuming that there was already an incitement. Here's what he said. He said Trump argued he knew that his most hardcore supporters were willing to direct violence at elected officials after a kidnapping plot targeting Michigan Governor Whitmer last year was foiled. So he's talking about a whole entirely separate issue, totally outside the scope. And he's using it to show that there's a pattern here. He says, "My dear colleagues, is there any political leader in this world who believes that if he is ever allowed back by the Senate to get back into the Oval Office, that he would stop inciting violence to get his way? Would you bet the lives of more police officers on that? Would you bet the safety of your family on that? Would you bet the future of your democracy on that?" Very emotional, very charged language. He's basically talking about, sentencing at this point in time, and he's presuming that Donald Trump has already been convicted. In a criminal case, this type of language would have to be allowed, could be allowed at a sentencing phase, but not during the trial phase by most competent judges. After the January 6th attack, declared that his conduct is totally inappropriate, Raskin noted. He said, "So if he gets back into the office and it happens again, we'll have no one to blame but ourselves." So very emotional. And he was sort of setting the framework for the rest of this. Here's the slide on thinking past the sale. It's a persuasion tool where you get someone to think about what happens after they've made the decision or action. By doing so, you increase the odds that person actually makes the decision or takes that action. So like I said, the car dealer telling you, you're going to love taking your kids to soccer practice in this, it may actually make that parent more likely to buy the car. And this goes on and tells you a little bit about how it works. It's about self-fulfilling prophecies, and this sort of, I thought it into reality. So they were doing a lot of that today. And then we have Rep. Lieu says Trump showed no remorse, did not acknowledge the role in inspiring the rioters. So it's kind of more of a sentencing argument here where he's saying, if he would have been remorseful, maybe we wouldn't be here today. Donald Trump, if he would have just accepted responsibility, then we wouldn't have to be here. But since he's not showing any remorse, we know that he's going to do it again. So it's a very circular argument, and he's doing it here. He says Trump shows no genuine remorse, failed to take responsibility. Well, he hasn't been proven guilty of this thing yet for his role in inspiring the rioters. He urged senators to send a clear message with a vote to convict Trump to prevent another attack and deter future presidents who don't like the outcome of an election from believing they can follow Trump's lead. He said, I'm not afraid of Donald Trump running again in 4 years. I'm afraid he's going to run again and lose because he can do this again. Lieu said. So, All right. I mean, it's not much there on point other than to say that he deserves to be punished. But you got to prove that he did the thing that you're accusing him of first. So that was the highlight that came over from the Washington Post from his testimony. And, these were pretty short clips, blurbs that the Washington Post put up. So I'm just kind of going off of them. This is what they think is important. Washington Post, of course, in my opinion, is pretty favorable to a lot of sympathetic to the Democratic arguments. And we go on at 12:14 to Rep. DeGette, she says, or DeGette, I don't know how to say it, detailing how Trump emboldened domestic violent extremists. Okay, so this headline, this statement is a little bit closer. Now we're talking about some causation. Trump actually did something that emboldened the domestic violent extremists. So now we're not talking about sentencing or about inspiring future rioters or coming back and doing this again, or like Raskin was talking about, having this come back again if he's in the Oval Office a second time. Now we're talking about he did it, right? Or not. She says, this must be our wake-up call. We must condemn it because the threat is not over. All right, so we're not talking about what happened. We're talking about a continuing threat. Trump refused to condemn the type of violence. Instead, over and over, he's encouraged it. Our response must be different this time. So this is where she cites the Joint Intelligence Bulletin from the FBI National Counterterrorism. They said that after the Capitol Hill attack, top law enforcement agencies reported there's an increase in credible threats to the inauguration, which is already done and over, from Donald Trump's supporters. So Joe Biden was inaugurated. It's done. That's over. They're still referencing this report. Okay. She says, quote here, the shared false narrative of a stolen election and opposition to change and control of the executive and legislative branches of governments may lead to some individuals to adopt the belief that there is a political solution to address their grievances and that violent action is necessary, these agencies warned. So she didn't say that. That's what the agencies said. So, here again, they're sort of, lifting this out from the weeds, not talking so much about what actually happened, but they're just saying, look, if we don't do something here, the consequences are likely to reoccur. We're going to be back here again because of something. Because it happened, we got to punish Trump, or else it's going to happen again, which is, it's very speculative, right? You don't know that. But you're making an argument because you're making an argument. You're appealing to emotion. You're appealing to fear. You're telling people this is an ongoing threat. Look, the FBI said so. The Counterterrorism Center said so. So we got to do something about this. Otherwise, we're all in jeopardy again. And that's good. That's a good use of fear. It's a good use of persuasion. Prosecutors try to do that all the time. They try to make your defendant look as scary as possible. And the defense side wants to reverse that. Make him look very benign, very, very lovable. They help grandmas cross the street and all that good stuff. So they're just trying to do that here. Instill a bunch of fear in the American people, arguably the senators, but the senators were asleep at the wheel. We have it at 12:30 about right around lunchtime. Rep. Sicilian outlines the personal toll the attack took. So again, we've talked a lot about this. By about this point, I was getting really sick and tired of hearing a lot of the personal toil and tumult that took place here. We got it. We saw like 4 hours of videos and imagery yesterday. So today, he goes back again. Look how awful this was. Yep, we got it. He says he detailed the physical and emotional toll. Got it, right? Yeah, including police officers who were injured or killed. We're going to talk about Brian Sicknick today. The attack on January 6th is one of the bloodiest intrusions in the Capitol since the British invaded in the War of 1812 and burned it to the ground. Really dramatic language. They were in there for about 2 hours and they were on their way. He opened a presentation by the harm done by the riot. They came perilously close to reaching the first 3 people in the line of the presidency. And we saw that yesterday. I'm not trying to downplay it. It was an awful situation, terrible, but this is already in evidence. We already got it. In fact, Donald Trump's attorney made the same point. He said, hey, we'll stipulate to this stuff. Okay, you don't need to play video after video after. We'll agree with it. We agree that it was bad and everything that happened was bad. What we disagree about is whether Trump caused it or not. So if they would be addressing the cause, that would be better. But here, again, they're talking about the damage, the aftermath, without really getting to the meat of the argument, which is unfortunate. He says here, it wasn't just the vice president and the speaker. Rioters were prepared to take any member of Congress they found. He goes on, many were just kids, 20-somethings who came here to work because they believed in their country and they believed in working to make it better. Since January 6th, at least 7 members who hid with other members have tested positive for COVID. So now it goes to COVID, right? Harm. Look how harmful this is. At least 38 Capitol Police officers have either tested positive positive or been exposed. Nearly 200 National Guard troops who were deployed to our nation's capital provide all of us with the protection. They've all tested positive. Well, it could have been because your party, who was in control of the Senate and the House floor, had a bunch of the National Guard sleeping on the ground throughout the congressional building, thrown in a garage with no facilities. That might have been the cause of it. You called them there in the aftermath and had them just kind of posted around until a couple days later they got some cots finally delivered to them, or they could have gotten it from any other source. But you can see what they're doing. They're expanding the scope. That net is getting so wide that they're just trying to capture any possible ramification from this thing, including COVID, that there's really no causal connection that they can make legitimately to tie it to the specific day on January 6th. I mean, if they can make that claim, then I guess that's fine, but I'm not sure that they can, okay, because it's a virus and it's been quite some time since this all took place. And there are other superseding and intervening causes that could cause somebody to have COVID. Wasn't just what happened on January 6th. All right, but they got to do what they got to do. They got to lump COVID into it as well. So about 1:30, we get Rep. Castro says the Senate impeachment is a chance to send a message back to the world about what America stands for. Felicia Sanmez posted this update. So again, they're talking about, this is the high ground maneuver. They're lifting it up. They're just explaining that the world is watching. He says here, since the incident at the Capitol, Russian, Iranian, Chinese influence actors have seized the opportunity to amplify the narratives in furtherance of their policy interest amid the presidential transition. He pressed senators to take action. We cannot let them use what happened on January 6th to define us, who we are, and what we stand for. We get to define ourselves by how we respond to the attack on January 6th. He noted, even our allies are speaking up, and quoted Canadian and German officials denouncing the attack and calling for accountability. So, okay, so, right, it's the high ground. It's, hey, this hurt America. Our allies are looking at us. This is sort of, I think they call this concern trolling. And I actually get a lot of this sometimes from some of my peers. They'll reach out and say, Rob, the things you talk about on your show, they're just concerning to me, and I hope that you can do better. I'm just thinking about you, right? Same argument here. Our allies are just looking at America. Hey, America, we're worried about this. We're worried about you. Now's your opportunity to change course. Will you do that? And that's persuasive to people, right? That's why it's called concern trolling. It works because people go, oh man, maybe I am being a piece of garbage. Maybe I should think of this moment in history. Maybe I am Senator Mitt Romney and I go, yeah, you know what? Yeah, maybe I care about what the Russians think. Okay, you're right. I'm going to vote to impeach him. So it's the high ground maneuver. It's fallacious as hell. It's not pertinent to the underlying issue about whether Trump caused this or not, but it is persuasive. And a lot of people around the country are going to fall for that hook, line, and sinker. They're just going to listen to that and go, yeah, we got to do something here. And it riles a lot of people up, right? The rest of the world is watching and judging us. All right. So then we get this afternoon over to Rep. Nagusi, who argues against Trump's First Amendment defense. And what does he say here? This update was by Colby Itkowitz over at the Washington Post. He says here, he began the House manager's task of preemptively dismantling Trump's defense, beginning with the notion that a former president's January 6th speech was protected by the First Amendment. And we saw some of these arguments in both memorandum that were submitted to the Senate prior to the trial starting. And these are the pre-buttals. So we have Nagusi, and then we have Ted Lieu, who comes back for our last update. And when Joe was on the floor, he said, they are concerned not with the facts that actually occurred, the facts that we've proven, which is debatable, but with an alternative set of facts where President Trump did nothing but deliver a controversial speech at a rally. The congressman noted that several legal experts have called the First Amendment defense, quote, legally frivolous, and said it's a distraction to avoid discussing the facts of the case. President Trump wasn't just some guy with political opinions who showed up at a rally and delivered controversial remarks. He's the president of the U.S. He had spent months and months using the unique power of that office, his bully pulpit, to spread the big lie that the election had been stolen. And as somebody who's a big fan of the First Amendment, I think it's critical. I think it's absolutely essential to what happens in this country. That's why it's the First Amendment. I've made that point many times. There is nothing, I think, that is secondary to that, because you have to talk. You have to be able to talk freely in order to talk about any other issue in the country. right? If you can't communicate, then you can't talk about anything. And there are no issues that can be resolved. And I think that this is it's a bad precedent. I think it's a bad argument. I think it's very disappointing to hear that we have elected people in this country who have sworn an oath to uphold and defend our Constitution, who are then going in to a legal proceeding and making arguments that the First Amendment is just kind of a suggestion in most situations. We believe in it unless you're the president. We believe that you can talk about problems with our government, petition for a redress of grievances, freedom of expression. That's okay unless you're the president. Doesn't the president have the biggest stake of anybody in making sure that things are running well? If the president thought that the election was stolen, do we want him to not say that, or do we want him to be able to say that? I would imagine you would want them to be able to say that. Okay, and politicians, if they think that an election was stolen or fraudulent or had irregularities or whatever, then you would want them to speak up about it. And if we set a precedent here where now it's because you're the president, and if you disavow or if you disagree with how an election was run and you voice that, now you're inciting insurrection, so you can't talk about that stuff anymore. It's not a good argument. It's, I think, counter to the one of the most fundamental principles that is enshrined in our Constitution in this country. It's very disappointing to see him make that claim, but I understand why they're doing it, because it's a strong defense. It's a very strong defense. We want people to be able to speak their minds, and political speech is so highly protected, and I think Trump's speech falls directly within that. And we have the Brandenburg test to show us that. We've got a lot of other case law to show us that. So, I understand that they've got to go out there and make the best argument they can. I think this is a disappointing argument, especially from one of our elected officials. And then lastly, our last pre-buttal comes over from Ted Lieu. He said that they're rejecting the claim of an unfair trial. So, these were the posts this is what he said. Not a lot of quotes here because they were summarizing his argument. He says House Democrats sought to preemptively undercut arguments from Trump's lawyers about the impeachment process in anticipation of the presentation. He defended the House decision to impeach Trump before he left office. He says that Trump's lawyers suggested that he was not given due process because the House deliberately delayed the start of the Senate trial. Lieu reminded senators about that an impeachment proceeding is distinct from a criminal trial. Yes, we know that, because in those trials, a defendant has certain constitutional rights because the potential punishment includes a prison sentence. He's saying, even so, Trump's attorneys will have an opportunity starting Friday to make their case to the Senate and ask questions. President Trump is receiving any and all process that is due. Okay, so he doesn't actually address the allegation, right, that Trump's not getting a fair shake here. And I've already sort of beaten that to death. He has not been able to cross-examine any witnesses. All of the evidence that's been admitted has been hearsay, stacked on hearsay. It's statements from tweets. It's reports from CNN people. It's all external sources. You have a judge who is a Democrat, who's a witness and a juror. You have a snap impeachment. You've got, the whole thing was just, okay. The scope was expanded beyond anything that would have been allowed in a regular court of law. And so what he says is, due process? Well, we gave him the due process that's due because this isn't like a criminal trial. This is like a impeachment trial. And he got the due process that he needs, all right? He's not going to prison for this thing. So don't try to equate this to a criminal trial, even though it's high crimes or misdemeanors, and one of those high crimes, allegedly according to their own documents, is incitement for insurrection. So shouldn't it have some of the remnants of criminal procedure in impeachment procedure? Shouldn't it be closely analogous? And it's not. Ted Lieu just says, okay, he's not going to prison, therefore it's a different standard. And under the different standard, which he didn't define for us, he says he's gotten any and all process that is due. All right. So that's basically a recap of what happened today. As I mentioned, the good and the bad. Democrats, good persuasion, a lot of thinking past the sale, a lot of talk about an ongoing threat, very emotional, very charged language. They took the high grounds where they were saying this is about the world now. This isn't about Trump versus the Democrats. This is about the world. What do our allies think? They talked a little bit about due process in the First Amendment, and they had generally good energy. They were overly duplicative when we get to the bad about their personal stories. We saw a lot of that, a lot of harm, a lot of trauma, a lot of Everything is awful now because of Trump, and we got to punish him as a result. They expanded the scope way beyond anything that I thought was reasonable. They're now talking about the world. Now they're using that to their advantage, but I think in terms of legitimate procedure, it was just way too much. They were talking about post-incitement. What did he do after the fact? Well, that's not relevant to what he did to cause it. They were talking about the damage that took place. They really spent a lot of time talking about the need for penalties in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again, thinking past the sale. They watered down the First Amendment beyond any recognition, in my opinion. Very little addressing of the due process in a substantive way that would have made a lawyer satisfied. And they were really focused on the consequences, not so much on the actual criminality. You got to prove criminality before you can talk about what the consequences are, and they sort of flipped that a little bit. Now, Trump is going to be starting tomorrow. His defense team apparently is going to be wrapping this thing up in one day. So they got 16 hours. Sounds like they're probably going to use 4 or 5 of it, which is not a bad strategy. This article came over from CNN, and it was written by Caitlin Collins. She says here, former President Donald Trump defense team, they expect to finish its argument in the trial by Friday night. 2 sources tell CNN. So that's going to be tomorrow night. His lawyers will take the Senate floor on Friday after the impeachment managers wrap up on Thursday today, but they're not expected to use all of their allotted time. Each side gets 16 hours for a presentation. Attorneys David Scone, Bruce Castor, Michael Vanderveen, we got William Brennan. They're all expected to speak tomorrow during Friday's arguments, according to a person familiar with the plan. They're going to be using videos of Democratic lawmakers. They plan to argue the Democrats glorified violence by recreating the January 6 riots, which is a bizarre argument to make. I'll get into that. They will claim that the trial is unconstitutional, and they're going to stress Trump's First Amendment rights. Those are good arguments, I think. Trial's unconstitutional, very, very limited, due process. And we also saw a First Amendment argument, which I think is going to be another argument. Good argument. Because the defense team is so disorganized, Trump's allies are apprehensive about how the defense will go. Trump erupted on Tuesday as Castro made a meandering, bizarre opening statement, the same statement that we sort of were scratching our heads about. So let's go back to this. They plan to argue that the Democrats glorified violence by recreating the January 6 riots. I don't understand what that argument is. So they're going to go out there tomorrow and say the Democrats played that evidence and that's glorifying violence. Okay, so what? So what do you want them to do about that? Dismiss the impeachment or vote? I don't understand. So this is why these types of arguments are bad. If you are saying that I did something bad, but you also did something bad, you are sort of giving up your argument, right? You're acknowledging that you did something bad. So why would the Trump attorneys go out there and say, oh, well, you Democrats did something bad? That's sort of presuming that you're admitting that Trump did something bad. And you're saying, well, what you did is just as bad. It's sort of, irrelevant. It's not what you're trying to prove. If you wanted to prove that, or at least make the argument that the Democrats have also said things like fight, 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 yeah, that's a separate thing. But glorifying violence by recreating the January 6th riot, don't know where they're going with that, but we'll see what they have tomorrow. Lindsey Graham was out, and he said the not guilty vote is growing after today. He posted this early this morning, so before he even presumably, when was that? Yeah, he posted that early today, so probably on the East Coast. The not guilty vote is growing after today. He said, I think most Republicans found the presentation by the House managers offensive and absurd. Full interview here. So that's one man's take on it. He was on Hannity if you want to go watch that entire clip. The link is in the slides. So that's it for day one of impeachment. We've got tomorrow scheduled for Donald Trump, and it sounds like his defense team is going to be buttoning it up tomorrow. Maybe we'll get a vote. Maybe we'll get a vote Saturday or Sunday. Maybe we'll get a vote tomorrow. We can just close this and just put it back in the closet in the bottom. We'll never have to see it again. That sounds pretty good.